evening, voters. Before we move on to the big debate tonight, there's an interesting data point in a report that has emerged that deserves a little bit of our attention. Highest unemployment in 4 decades. 1 crore jobs lost between December 27 and December 2018. Unemployment rate above 7%. Countless of these data points have been doing the rounds, fueling the jobs crisis debate in our country in the past few months. But as the government firefights this debate and counters it with its own arguments and statistics involving the EPFO accounts and the Mudra loans, the industry body CII today seems to have come to government's rescue. Now, CII says that recent reforms that have been ushered in by the government are creating new livelihoods across existing and emerging sectors. In fact, CII has focused on 8 sectors, but I'll come to that in just a bit. The big headline of this report is that the industry body estimates about 10 crore jobs by 2025. With skill levels rising and substantial growth in startups and new businesses, the quality of jobs is also being enhanced, says the CII report. In fact, this is an actual quote by the CII president himself, Rakesh Bharti, to the PTI. The arguments that this report really banks on says ease of doing business, cut in tax rate for smaller businesses, a lot of which has just happened in the recent past, and reduction in interest rates, which also has happened just in the recent past, is benefiting the small and medium enterprises. The 8th sector that CII report really banks on is retail, construction, transport, logistics, tourism, hospitality, handlooms and handicraft, textiles and apparels, food processing, and automotive. So does this argument really make sense? Is there merit to saying 10 crore jobs by 2025? And what does that number really mean for our young working population, for the young India? Let's have a quick conversation. Akash Jindal, economist, joining me this evening. Professor Arun Kumar, Chair Professor, Institute of Social Sciences and former professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU. Professor Arun Kumar, good evening to you. Let's begin with you. I've just quoted a few of the highlights of this CII report. Are you convinced, do you think, that as the current scenario is, and with the steps that the government has taken, which are listed by CII, we can look at 10 crore jobs in the next 6 years?
You know, there are several points that I'd like to make. And first is that the report says that in the last 3 years also jobs were created, whereas almost all evidence says that jobs are lost. Whether you look at the All India Manufacturers Organization, whether you look at Punjab, Haryana, Delhi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, State Bank of India survey, etc. So, you know, there's a bit of a doubt. Second point is when they say that in the coming years, you know, 10 crore more jobs will be created, then it's like saying that yes, with new investment, new jobs will be created, but also the question arises, how many jobs may be lost? So there is direct employment and there is indirect employment. You know, to take, for instance, construction sector. Now, when construction sector gets mechanized, then some jobs are created in the mechanization process, but a lot of jobs are lost because mechanization displaces labor. Similarly, in agriculture, we have noticed that with mechanization, with tractorization, threshers, harvester combines and so on, some jobs are created, but 10 times more jobs are lost because, you know, these displaced jobs. And now, for instance, in transport sector, we are talking about, you know, in the US, not yet in India, but, you know, automatic cars, automatic trucks, etc. So, you know, that sort of thing, we have to be very careful. We have to ask, what is the net addition of jobs? How many are created and how many are lost as a result of the technical change that is taking place? The next point I'd like to make is that we have established methodology for counting employment, which is used by CMIE and which is used by NSSO. But this report, we don't know what is the methodology they are using. You know, unless we study the methodology and unless we find it's as robust as the NSSO report and the CMI report, we cannot quite depend on this report. So, you know, in a sense, the robustness of the methodology that is employed by CII, that has to be seen and then compared. So I would depend on the NSSO report and the CMI report as very important. The next point I'd like to make is they have quoted EPFO. Now, EPFO only counts those who may have been earlier in the informal sector and then converted to formal sector. It doesn't tell us how many new jobs were created. And the reason why the EPFO numbers may be going up is because certain rules were changed, certain concessions were given, so that those who are in the unregistered sector could come into the registration under the EPFO, and the industry would gain advantage out of that. So in a sense, for all these reasons, I have my doubts about the CII methodology, but as I said, I haven't seen the detailed methodology. I would take a look at that and then maybe comment. But at the moment, I'd still depend on the CMIE and the NSSO data that has been coming out.
Okay, so one aspect, of course, is like you pointed out, the jobs that have been lost, the unemployment rise that we have seen. Keeping that in mind and where we stand today, to now say, but because of what the government has done, the tax cuts, incentives, the interest rate reductions that have now happened, and all of this, a lot of this has obviously happened in the last few weeks. Now we see a big fillip to these enterprises, these smaller companies and medium-sized companies really taking off and them actually creating these jobs. Akash Jindal, what do you feel? Is CII right now being very optimistic, or is there merit to this data point that they're giving us?
See, I want to share some data with you. Now, 2019 and 2020, I'm talking about this calendar years. These are going to be India growth years, high growth for India. There's a World Bank report which was released in January 2019. Now what it says is that in 2018-19, India is expected to grow by around 7.3%. And in the coming 2 years, the growth is expected to go up to 7.5%. This is what is expected. My organization, akashjindal.in, has done an analysis. Now there's another global report which says the global economy is getting into a slowdown and the world GDP may go down. The growth may be only 3.3% because there's already America-China trade war. America is negatively impacted. China is severely impacted. China has, they have downgraded their own GDP projection from 6.5 to 6%. Again, in Europe, you have uncertainties of Brexit. European economies are already facing slowdown. So the point which I want to drive down home is that perhaps 2019, the calendar year, and 2020 are going to be India years, India growth years, because our GDP growth is expected to be more than double of the world. So when GDP growth is going to be like that, so there's a basis, there's a possibility of us generating jobs. I'm not saying there's a certainty. There's a possibility, there's a ground. Now, what happens? We have already seen in the past 1 or 2 months, the government has already given concessions on GST. GST has been reduced in many areas. In housing also, it has been reduced. Tax has been reduced for SMEs. Interest rates are down. So I think clearly there's a basis there's a reason to believe this report that this could be true. I'm not saying this would be true, because
Correct.
One thing more I would like to say. Now, I wouldn't talk about any particular political party, but just allow me to complete. I think if we have a stable government in the center, we are already about to enter elections. So I think whichever party makes a stable government, then I think we can move up to generation of lots and lots of jobs. Because I think some of the manufacturing is going to shift from China to India, the way the China economy is cracking, economy is crashing. So India is going to benefit a bit from that.
I get the point you're making,
yes,
Mr. Jindal, but let's...
a possibility of this
I think you're being
true.
slightly, I mean, I get your point, but let's also remember the fact that that's exactly what we would have said in 2014. and then this government came to power, and with an overwhelming majority, and the biggest thought process and expectation within the India Inc. was, well, now we have a stable government, a majority government, and they are going to take those tough decisions, and they're going to bring about that change. But look at us today. We're still debating right now about our growth numbers. There is still a debate about job creation. The other aspect is about the old methodology which is being used by NSSO and the Labour Department, Professor Arun Kumar. But you raised that point. The government, though, is of the belief that that methodology doesn't work anymore, because you have jobs being created in newer sectors that don't get counted, that don't get factored in. If we look at this report, there are 8 sectors that they have primarily looked into. They've looked into textiles and apparels, which is usually what you would use as a measure, into retail, which as a sector right now is not doing that great the way it was 10 years ago, into construction, which right now as a sector isn't doing that great. Perhaps it will pick it up. This report also factors in tourism, hospitality, logistics, handloom and handicraft, food processing as an interesting sector, and automotive. If you look at these 8 sectors and then say that perhaps these are the 8 sectors which are going to drive the employment opportunities for us in the next 5 to 6 years, Professor, does that make sense? Do you agree with that logic at least?
Some of the sectors will certainly create jobs. There's no doubt about it. But some other sectors will lose jobs. Like for instance, in the construction sector, while some jobs will be created, mechanization will reduce jobs. Similarly, in the textile sector, as you mechanize, some jobs will be lost, some jobs will be created. So what we have to look at the net employment creation. And I'd like to point out that if the international agencies are saying that the rate of growth will be 7%, they don't collect data, they only depend on the government's data. So government's data has to be questioned, and when the government says we don't have data on employment, and therefore the data on GDP also becomes suspect, then we have to worry that the data on GDP, if it is suspect and the international agencies are projecting from that, then there's a problem. There is supporting evidence that the Manrega demand has been shooting up because a lot of people from the urban areas went back to rural areas because of demonetization and loss of jobs, and they haven't come back. The next point is that the credit offtake in the industrial sector has been historically low.
Yes.
And that is because the MSME sector credit offtake was down, and even the organized sector credit offtake was down. And that's an indication of slow growth. So my argument has been that the unorganized sector has been declining, and that is not factored into the GDP data of the government. If the GDP data factors in the unorganized sector, the rate of growth today will be 1%, not 7%. Okay. And that is what is consistent with loss of jobs. 7% would have meant a good job creation, but unfortunately the rate of growth in MSME, which has been negative, that has been driving the jobs down. And another point which needs to be remembered is that between 2004 and 2009, the rate of growth of the economy was high, but employment was not created because of mechanization. And that is something that can happen all over again. And look at investment. Investment has been down, and investment is one precursor of employment generation. And uncertainty is increasing, and capacity utilization is not very high, and that's why investment is down. So unless investment rises, I don't see employment rising. So investment will
Professor Arun Kumar, point taken.
Unorganized sector does better.
Okay, very quickly, let me just bring in Akash Jindal for his response before we wrap this up.
Yeah, I want to say something.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think my friend is right. I think India is going to get decent amount of investment. That's the point where I wanted to reach. With China slowing down, Europe slowing down for sure, US also slowing down, India is going to be a good FDI destination in the coming 2 years. I expect a decent amount. My organization, akashjindal.in, expects a decent amount of FDI in India in the coming 2 years. Now, when you talk about sectors, let me tell you, construction and real estate is a sector which is a highly manpower intensive sector. We have already taxation concessions in that sector. Now when construction happens, right from our worker brothers to masons to carpenters to electricians to plumbers, so many people get employed, right from our brother who is a worker who gets 500 rupees daily to a super specialist architect who perhaps earns 50,000 rupees per day. lots and lots of people get jobs. So construction is one sector which has a cascading impact on the entire economy.
Correct.
And when we talk about stability, you are right, 2014 also gave us stability, but stability, I'm not talking about stability as the only factor.
Yes.
Now see, when 2014 came in, where was China? China in the early 2010, 11, 12, it was growing at a robust basis. Now China has crashed. So I think there's an opportunity for India to grow.
Okay.
Europe is down. Brexit uncertainties are pulling Europe down.
Well,
my friend talks about
you know it,
global,
Mr. Jindal, you know it, and
now,
I know it. Global factors are always going to be at play. There will always be, some good points and some negative global points that will try and drag our economy down. So, a good government with a good policy in place will always factor that in and then have a policy that will just work for our country, irrespective of the turmoil that may be going on globally. If we stand to benefit from what's happening globally, or if China is going down and that helps us, that of course it should be an added boon. Completely out of time, but I do appreciate Akash Jindal and Professor Arun Kumar joining us at the last minute. This report came out a few hours ago and we thought it was necessary to bring it to the notice of our viewers as well, because CII is one of the biggest confederations of the Indian industry, and this is a CII report that says that they think things are going to look up from here on and that 10 crore jobs or livelihood opportunities will be created. Of course, the other big question is, will that be enough, keeping in mind number of people who are coming into the working age and looking for employment, and will it be enough, keeping in mind the kind of job loss that we have seen in the recent past? Thank you so much for joining us on this debate. We move on to debate number 2.